Good evening and welcome. Tonight we'll be going over the history and geography of the state of Abia in Nigeria. I have it zoomed out so you can get a good idea of where we are in the world. You can see the Gulf of Guinea and the Atlantic Ocean here, the coastline, and even the Niger River Delta here. So we are going to be looking at Abia State right here. So let me zoom it in. It might wobble a little bit. You know how this goes. There we go. Also, my floorboards are extra creaky tonight. So anytime I move, of course it's not doing it now. Anytime I wobble, there's some kind of creak. But now, of course, it's not. But anyway. Abia, Nigeria, you can see is a very small state. They get kind of tiny in this area here. Abia, or God's own state, as its motto says, is a little tiny corner of southern Nigeria, very near to the oil industry. You can see all the little oil wells out here. There is oil within Abia. They produce crude oil here, send it off to be processed. But for the most part, Abia is an agricultural region. 70% of the population farms, mostly things like yams and other kind of like root vegetables. And the biggest one, though, is palm oil. That's their biggest one by far. The city of Aba here has a huge marketplace. For some reason, Google Earth didn't have very good pictures of like anything in Abia, so there's no tablet tonight, unfortunately. I really scraped all over the place trying to find something cool, but there are some really cool YouTube videos of people walking through the marketplace of Aba, and it's really neat. You can look those up if you prefer. Abia, the name, is a I don't know what it's called when you put together like the first letters of things and spell out a word. So the A comes from Aba here. The B comes from Bende. The I comes from Isikuto, which I believe is like up in this area here. And the last A is for Afikpo, which you can see is actually no longer in Abia. We'll talk about that in its history. It's kind of unfortunate for the naming scheme, but Abia sounds nice, I think. It's a nice little name. The capital of Abia is Umuahia. They also have a really big marketplace and lots of big like pillars. Like anywhere where there's a roundabout, there's a tall pillar that says like, this is Umuahia, or welcome to Abia, or God's own state, things like that. It's pretty cool. There's also quite a few rivers in the area, but they're very hard to see on here because it's so small. There's the Aba River, and I believe over here is the Imo River. So the most important aspect of cultural life in Abia is that it is part of the Igbo culture. Nigeria has many different cultures within it, but for the most part, the northern area is dominated by the Hausa. This corner over here is dominated by the Yoruba, and this corner over here is dominated by the Igbo. So the Igbo have many different customs and traditions. We'll talk about some of them in tomorrow's video, and they are very prominent in Abia State. But let's talk about the history of Abia. It's really fascinating. So like I said, it's been inhabited by Igbo people for as far back as time goes, right? As far back as we know, the Igbo culture has lived here. Many different tribes within the Igbo culture and cultures within the Igbo culture. And you can find a majority of them in Abia. In 1690, the Aro Confederacy was formed in a town called Arochukwu, which isn't on the map, but it's about right here. Now, what was important about Arochukwu was that it was home to their oracle, which the British would term the Long Juju. The Long Juju is this cave network, and deep within it was the oracle. And if you committed a crime, the spiritual leaders of the Confederacy would take you into the cave to the oracle, and the oracle would determine whether or not you were guilty or innocent. If you were innocent, you got to go home. If you were guilty, you were killed. And there was a river that would flow out from the cave, and your blood was supposed to spill down the river so that, your friends and family outside waiting to see the verdict would know whether or not you were coming out alive. But there was an interesting aspect about the long juju in that the spiritual leaders of the Oro Confederacy realized that they could just, instead of killing these people, could just sell them off to slavery. So there were other tunnels that led outside, like a side exit. So if you were found guilty, you would not be killed. You would go out the side exit and then be sold into slavery. And the British were, pretty excited about that. It was like a good deal, They would pay off these people and they would get slaves to send out. So a surprising amount of people were suddenly found guilty of random crimes, and the people grew wealthy, right? But eventually the British became very anti-slavery. One, the human rights aspect of it. There were many different movements throughout Great Britain that were anti-slavery. As you can imagine, it's obvious nowadays, right? But also the British figured out that it was more profitable to combat slavery than participate in the slave trade. They would set up a base, or many bases along the coast, the biggest one being in Lagos here. And they would patrol the coast for slave ships, and they would capture them. They would, prosecute the slavers there, probably for some kind of reward if they were wanted. They would seize the ship, free ship. And then the unfortunate people on board who had been kidnapped and were being shipped off, they would go to other places like Sierra Leone or Liberia, or even throughout Nigeria here, and get jobs on British farms and, put more money into the pockets of the British. What was it called? I think it was called the Niger Company in this area, since they were based along the Niger River, So, anyway, the spiritual leaders here were like, well, that doesn't really help us. That cuts off our biggest money maker. So they were selling slaves on the black market, they were selling it to illegal slavers. And when the British found out, they were very upset. This area was under British protection. It wasn't officially part of what was it? It was British West Africa or something. So the British were very upset when they found out that the long juju practices were still ongoing. They were like, okay, one, you can't be selling people into slavery. By now it was 1900, so that was a big no-no, right? Also, they were like, they're practicing these weird animalistic pagan beliefs when we're trying to push Christianity on them, and they're resisting, so that's also not a good thing. So in 1901, they declared war on the peoples, called the Anglo-Aro War. They came in, they destroyed the inside of the cave, they killed their oracle, basically, and within a few months they had taken over the area, they absorbed it into their territory, and it would eventually become part of British Nigeria. Now, as you can imagine, the people were not pleased about this, them coming in and destroying their culture, even though, I see where the British were coming from with the whole slavery thing. I think, destroying their sacred cave was kind of crossing a line, So people weren't very pleased with the British presence here. It kind of came to a head in 1929 in an event that's known as the Women's War. Basically, what happened was women were not taxed. If they owned their own businesses, they were not taxed until the British decided, well, actually, we're going to tax these women. And so tax collectors would show up to these women's businesses and say, you need to pay up. And they were like, with what? We didn't set aside money for taxes. There was one lady in particular who flew into a rage, as you can imagine. she started yelling at the person, like, how much does your grandmother pay in taxes, right? And then she poured palm oil over his head and ran off and told all her friends, got them incensed, and it turned into like a 10,000 women riot. And it was in Abba, and they like attacked places. The British had to come in and put a stop to it. Thankfully, it didn't get too out of hand. There was some loss of life, but it was not extensive. I mean, it was like middle-aged women and grannies, rising up. So, the British aren't going to like fire on crowds of grannies, But it was when everything really came to a head and people got fed up with the British. It was pretty much not pro-British, but not anti-British. It was a part of life at that point when Nigeria declared independence in 1960. They became part of an area known as the Eastern Region. And we'll talk about it tomorrow. If you know your Nigerian history, it was pretty unstable. You had these three major ethnic groups with three different agendas, and each one didn't feel heard unless their culture was the one in power, right? The Igbo in particular, after many slights against the people there, decided to secede from Nigeria in this southern section here, and they formed their own union known as Biafra. And civil war broke out. Abia was part of that, it being an Igbo, primarily Igbo state, right? That lasted for 2 years, and once Biafra was put to an end, once the civil war ended and Biafra lost, this area became the Imo state. They started drawing up states. Nigeria at this point had decided to become a democratic republic like the United States, so they were drawing up states. In 1991, the lines were redrawn again, and that was when Abia was formed. 1991. It was later changed, though, in 1996 when lines were redrawn, and the state of Ebonyi was officially formed with part of Afikpo there. So Afikpo then was no longer part of Abia. And pretty much that's where the history comes to an end. Like I said, I looked all over Google Earth to show you some neat things. It's mostly just forest and farmland. But YouTube has so many cool videos, mainly of Abba, but also like the forest, the jungles, the beautiful river streaming through, different sites to see, little waterfalls and things. There's some lovely sites in Abia. They're just not on Google Earth. They're all on YouTube. So if you want to get an idea of the landscape, just type in Abia to the YouTube search, and there's lots of cool videos. Like, I can't recommend one. I loved them all. So if you want to see what the landscape, what the marketplaces, what the cities look like in Abia, you can check that out for yourself. So that's going to be it for tonight. Next time we're going to hop over to further down the Gulf of Guinea coast to the Ivory Coast. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope that you have a very good night.